Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. I'm glad that you are following with us as we're continuing our chronological study of the Old Testament. Right now, we are in the book of 2nd Samuel. Today's scripture reading, chapter 14 and chapter 15. Now, I've titled this devotional, When a Leader Fails. Well, because today's scripture reading it tells two long chapters, chapters 14 and 15 of 2 Samuel, I am choosing with this a particular daily study to do just an overview of both of those chapters. They are central to our study of the life of David. Now, the saga and division between David, the king of Israel, and his third-born son, Absalom, does continue in 2 Samuel chapter 14. Now, after murdering his brother Amnon, Absalom, you might remember, sought refuge in Geshur, which was his mother's birthplace. Well, sadly, 3 years of exile passed. David did not seek justice for his son Amnon, who had been murdered, nor did he restore his fellowship with Absalom. That brings us then to 2 Samuel chapter 14. Now, Joab's plot to bring Absalom to Jerusalem is found in the first 20 verses. Now, we need to ask the question, who was Joab? Well, Joab, one of David's trusted counselors, he was captain of the army. He was a mighty warrior. He understood David's longing for Absalom, 2 Samuel 13 and verse 39. And so Joab set in motion the circumstances that moved the king to invite his son Absalom to return to Jerusalem. And so we find recorded in 2 Samuel 14 verses 2 through 17 a detail of Job's plan and how he recruited a woman to convey a parable to the king. Now, feigning as a mourner, this woman spun a tale of two sons and lamented that one son had killed the other. Well, the woman's tale moved David's heart, and the king determined he would show grace and spare her son's life, who was the murderer. Of course, knowing, though, that the penalty of the law would demand the death of the murderer. However, as soon after he passed judgment and gave his verdict to show grace to this woman's son, he realized the woman's story paralleled his own life and failure to show grace and restore Absalom. Now, David saw through the tale then, and he supposed that Joab, his right-hand man, had brought about his verdict for the king to forgive his murderous son. Well, as you read verses 21 through 24 of 2 Samuel 14, here we find David's command for Absalom's return. And so David then directed Joab to go to Geshur, invite Absalom to return to Jerusalem, yet with one provision: his son would not be welcomed in the king's court. Ever soft in dealing with the sins of his own household, David's failure to confront Absalom, his refusal to receive him, provoked a resentment that would never be appeased in the heart of his son. And so consider then with me 2 Samuel 14 and verse 25 through 33, which I would suggest is Absalom's persona, his personality, how he was perceived by the people, and then his reconciliation to the king. Now, David failed to comprehend Absalom's heart was against him as the father and the king. Therefore, the king allowed his son movements to go unchecked. He had freedom to go wherever he desired, with the exception of into the king's court. Physically handsome, Absalom used his freedom to earn the people's affection. Celebrated for the thickness of his long flowing hair, Absalom and his family came to be much praised in Israel. Well, as we consider the scriptures, 2 years passed, and the king never summoned his son to stand before him. When his appeals, that is Absalom's appeals to Joab to intervene with his father, failed, Absalom ordered Joab's fields be set ablaze. And thus Joab was forced to petition the king to give Absalom his son an audience. So that brings us to 2 Samuel 15. Now Absalom's plot to earn the people's affection is seen in the first 7 verses. Now, though received by his father, Absalom's bitterness and rebellious heart were not satisfied. Given himself the visage, the appearance of a powerful oriental king in chapter 15 and verse 1, the son of David plotted to weaken his father and deflect the people's affections to himself. And David sadly followed a familiar pattern of weakness that we have seen in his life as a father and as a king, for he did nothing, and he allowed Absalom to steal the hearts of the men of Israel. And so we read in 2 Samuel 15 and verse 7, just by a side note, and it came to pass after 40 years. Well, to be honest with you, I don't know what the 40 years might mean or from whence they were counted. And so we certainly know 40 years had not passed since Absalom returned to Jerusalem. And so it's one of the things that we'll just simply say it's known only to God. But that brings us to verses 7 through 30 of chapter 15. Here we have Absalom's insurrection and David's flight. Now, enough men of Israel followed Absalom's rebellion that David was forced to flee the city with his loyal servants and his family. He only left behind 10 concubines. It's believed that they probably were left behind to look after the palace. And sadly, they're going to be used by Absalom to shame and humiliate his father. While accompanying the king in his flight out of the city were his mercenary bodyguards, whom we have already introduced in chapter 8, verses 16 through 18. Now, when David saw that the priests were bringing the ark of God out of the city, he instructed them to return it to its place in Jerusalem. You see, his command, I believe, expressed his faith and confidence that he would one day return to his throne. Well, we read the sad story in verse 30 that as David ascended the Mount of Olives, he looked back on the city of Jerusalem, he and all those with him, and they wept and mourned what had befallen the king and the city. Well, we look at verses 31 through 37 as we near an end of our study, and here we have Absalom's co-conspirator and David's spy. Notice then with me that David learned that Ahithophel, the grandfather of Bathsheba, had joined Absalom in the insurrection against the king. The king therefore prayed, "O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness," is found in verse 31. Well, soon after, David was joined by a loyal friend and a servant, Hushai, or Hushai, some might would say, the Archite, whom the king commanded to return to Jerusalem, join himself to Absalom, and thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. Well, at the risk of his own life, Hushai obeyed the king's command, and he did return to Absalom's court, where he acted as a spy. Well, let's close today's study by noticing this is a tragic time in David's life. Now, it will continue tomorrow. But once again, we've been reminded of the terrible toll of David's sins and the consequences of his failure as a father and king to address and judge the sins of his son and others. I cannot think of a better verse to close with. This should be a warning and a lesson to us all. It's found in Galatians 6 and verse 7, where we read, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." May you and I be reminded the sinful choices we make today may wreak havoc in our life tomorrow. May we choose to embrace the Lord and be close to Him. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of this Shepherd's Heart and following these daily devotions. Bye-bye.